Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This will be a great opportunity to discuss the Supreme Court's dangerous decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, including the implications for reproductive rights here at home in Washington's 9th District and across the country, as well as the broader implications of this decision for civil rights. My name is Jalen, and I'll be your moderator for the event. Joining us for this discussion is Congressman Adam Smith, who represents the 9th District of Washington State, serving parts of King and Pierce counties, including Seattle, Bellevue, and Tacoma. Mercedes Sanchez, Director of Communications for Cedar River Clinics, a local reproductive health center with 4 locations across Washington State. Kia Guarno, Executive Director of Pro-Choice Washington, and Lisa Hume-Schultz, Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Planned Parenthood Alliance Advocates. This evening's panel will first begin with opening remarks from each of our panelists, and then we will take questions from the audience. The panel will last 1 hour, and we will address as many of your questions as we can during that time. We will begin with opening remarks from Congressman Smith and then turn it over to our other panelists. So Congressman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And mostly I do want to hear from the other panelists and get to the questions. So I'll keep my remarks brief. But we have to understand how grave this threat is to individual rights and liberties. And there's like multiple layers to it. Obviously, right up front, the threat to women's health and the threat to reproductive freedom. As we see states all across the country restricting women's access to abortion, that has a ripple effect on women's health in ways that too many people don't fully appreciate. So we have to make it clear what that threat is, show the impacts, and make sure people are aware of it. Second is the logic behind the court's ruling has the potential to strip away even more rights. There's a focus on contraception. There's a focus on LGBTQ rights, things that have been secured in the Constitution that have not been allowed to be subject to the whims of individual legislatures. Are now all open. So it is difficult to overstate the impact of this on individual rights, certainly on women's rights, reproductive freedom, and rights just in general. So don't underestimate it. I saw some conservatives afterwards going, oh, it's just an exaggeration that, this is going to spread to other things. And then fortunately, Clarence Thomas in his infinite wisdom put it down on paper. I mean, literally, I was reading a column from Jonathan Turley talking about how, left-wing extremists are just exaggerating. This will never happen. Literally, the day after he wrote that, Thomas's opinion came out and made clear just how wrong he was. So there's that. Second, we do need to do what we can do in the short term. I don't know what executive action President Biden can take. I think his options are fairly limited for a variety of different reasons, but we need to explore every single one of those options, including the possibility of using federal land in states that have outlawed reproductive rights to use those as clinics and facilities. I don't know what the possibilities are there. I've read a bunch of the analysis. There are challenges and problems with it in a bunch of different ways, but I think we have to be aggressive and push it. But the last thing, the most important thing is we were talking beforehand, I think it was Lisa who was saying, this didn't happen in a week and it's not going to be fixed in a week. The right-wing conservative anti-choice movement has been organizing for 50 years, all right? Carefully, ploddingly, deliberately, and very aggressively. They have built support for their position, starting with things like the late-term abortion ban and trying to put it in phrases that were most popular amongst the broadest range, all the while where their goal was the outright ban that we know is not supported. We have to be just as smart about how we message, how we organize, and how we expand the number of people who are on our side. And I cannot emphasize this point enough. We cannot just preach to the choir on this. We can't say, oh, the majority is with us. The majority is with us on the basic issue without question. But as we have seen in legislative races across the country, they've been able to be persuaded to vote for people who aren't with us. We have to look at that. Why? Why are they making that decision? What are they listening to? What messages can we make that will be better able? Because at the end of the day, the best way at this point to protect choice is to elect pro-choice legislators in as many places as possible. We have to organize around that principle. Last final quick thing, I just read something the other day. The Supreme Court has assumed a lot of authority that the Constitution doesn't give it. I think we should take a very close look at what jurisdiction the court has and specifically limiting that legislatively. Look, their terms are in the Constitution. It's ridiculous that we pick judges for life and there's no accountability for them. But that is in the Constitution. What's not in the Constitution is the amount of jurisdiction that they've taken on. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say they have the right to decide what's constitutional and what's not. I think there are things legislatively that we can begin preparing to do to take away some of that power from the court. That's all I got. So thank you. I look forward to comments from our other panelists and then take your questions.
Great, thank you. Lisa, do we want to turn it over to you for some opening remarks?
Sure, I'm happy to kick us off. So I will say it's been about 2 weeks or almost 2 weeks since the Supreme Court has overturned nearly 50 years of precedent and eliminated this fundamental right. And in that time, my colleagues at Planned Parenthood, at Pro-Choice Washington, at Cedar River Clinics, all across the abortion provider network have been seeing patients who are scared and unsure of where to go and are being stripped of the right to this fundamental basic health care. And luckily, here in Washington, we have a long history of protecting, safeguarding, and expanding the right to access to abortion care. So in 1970, we were the first state to codify the right to abortion at the ballot box, which was wonderful. And in 1991, we further went to the ballot box to expand and solidify that right and ensure that you could access abortion care through public funding, which has been really critical to expanding access. And since then, the state has continued to expand access through things like the Reproductive Parity Act, which was critical legislation that ensured that for state-mandated regulated plans, if your plan covered maternity care, it must also cover abortion care. However, that hasn't been enough. There are patients who are on high deductible health plans who can't access that coverage. There are patients who are forced to travel long distances to access an abortion provider because of rural healthcare deserts, provider shortages, and simply the fear of providing care in this moment. And so we know that rights without access are meaningless and that we really need access and the provision of care to really protect the reputation that Washington has rightly developed as a safe haven for abortion access. And I'll just share, as we are seeing this moment of fear and panic across the country, which is real, abortion providers are here for patients across the country. In the last week alone, Planned Parenthood, and I know Cedar River Clinics is also experiencing something similar. We've seen patients from Alabama, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Ohio in 1 week since this began. So this is real. This is a public health crisis that has already begun. And we are really eager to have conversations with leaders like the Congressman and people in the administration to figure out how we can tackle what is a very real public health crisis and has really come to our door. And Washington is prepared to embrace that, and we're ready for the fight.
Thank you, Lisa. Mercedes, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I just want to start by doing a little intro about our clinic and what abortion providers are thinking and experiencing right now, as well as our concerns. So Cedar River Clinics provides first and second trimester abortions. We were founded in 1979. And as a second trimester provider, we've been serving patients from out of state for decades because of restrictive laws. As Lisa mentioned, Cedar River Clinics, Planned Parenthood, and other providers have been helping patients from other states as soon as the decision was announced. And I also just want to throw in, we've also been fielding calls from people in Washington who are confused about the law. And we've been really reassuring everyone that abortion remains legal in Washington state. And we hope everyone knows, and we think that is an important message to communicate, that there are providers in Washington state willing to serve, of course, the people of Washington, but people who need to travel to get this critical health care. The Guttmacher Institute estimated that Washington State will see an increase in 385% of out-of-state patients. And that number was based on states surrounding us. So as Lisa already mentioned, we're seeing people from across the country. And so much of what is challenging is that there are still a lot of unknowns, and we're doing our best to prepare for the unexpected. In communications with our partners, both here in Washington and nationally, the consensus and concern is that providers and clinics in states where abortion is legally protected will become the focus of the anti-abortion strategy, both legally and through harassment. We may be buried in legal actions, both civil and from hostile states themselves. These lawsuits could result in financial and resource burdens for both providers and clinics. We need also to be able to protect our patients from out of state against legal actions against them in their home states. We are also concerned about provider licenses and the cost of malpractice insurance being negatively impacted by the actions in hostile states. And of course, always a major concern is security. We expect a significant rise in harassment of clinics and providers, which always includes the risk of violence. The SCOTUS decision instantly put a target on providers in states that have legal protection for abortion. And this is months before the November election and months before our next state legislative session. So federal help is really necessary. We're hoping for meaningful support and protections as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, I'll turn it over for Kia for some opening remarks.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much to my fellow panelists and to Congressman Smith. I won't repeat what you've heard here, but I concur absolutely all the points that were made. So Pro-Choice Washington is the leading grassroots advocacy organization that is specifically focused on policy and political and legislative change around the broader reproductive freedom conversation. And so I just wanted to elevate the conversation around what we need to do in the long term. So this is a long game. Not only do we need solutions today, but we also need to build our movement back up and recognize the tactics that worked from the anti-abortion movement to take away our rights after 50 years. And that's really focusing on mobilizing within our own communities and focusing on having conversations one-on-one in a way that can really seed the change that we need to see over the next few decades and generations. And it also means really focusing on local elections. And so one of the things that was really impactful over the last 50 years was a quiet, well-funded focus on overturning very small local elections across the country, but specifically in places like Texas, which then paved the way for really restrictive and harmful policies like SB 8. And so thinking about this movement as not only a powerful collective, because it is a majority, and to your good point, Congressman Smith, it's a majority that believes in the basic right to protection and privacy around healthcare, and also to thinking about how we actually start to change those systems at the local level so that we can build a broader protection over time. And the reason that we really need to do this is a couple-fold. One is that we are seeing an absolutely imminent healthcare crisis coming our way. Not only is it specifically the negative health outcomes for individuals who become pregnant, but it also impacts conversations around fertility care, around cancer treatments, around contraceptive care, and around emergency care related to ectopic pregnancies and miscarriages. So we're talking about the full pregnancy experience, but we're also looking down the barrel of a socioeconomic crisis. And we've alluded to this a little bit throughout our conversation, but really there's been studies in the last couple of years led by UCSF that have demonstrated the direct link between economic outcomes and economic participation and the access to a wanted abortion. So in 2020, they found that if you were denied a wanted abortion, you are 4 times more likely to end up below the federal poverty line. There is also a direct link to economic participation in terms of employment rate, in terms of graduation rate, in terms of general ability to be part of this society. And so when you think about this as a whole future where you're taking out a huge percentage of society from full participation in the economy, this conversation not only talks about like the humanity of the rights that are being removed, but also our collective ability to live in a country that can sustain socioeconomic positions. And so this conversation is so multifaceted. And I think having these really in-depth conversations with your community is such a big part of how we can draw the long-term game here, in addition to some of these immediate changes. And I think the big part of that too is understanding what the actual language is around abortion care and really educating ourselves on what is the misinformation we're hearing right now and what is real. And as both of the panelists alluded to, there is a ton of misinformation out there about what is access, what is criminalization, what does it mean actually to get an abortion, when does that show up in our healthcare journey? And so really making sure that we're having these really well-educated and helpful conversations around what this actually means will play a really important role, not only for this upcoming election, which is essential, but in the long run when we think about this movement. And I'll finally say that this election that we're seeing in November is a very critical time for us to participate, as well as the next few. We in Washington State have 87% of our seats up for election in November. And as we've seen across the country, these elections matter, and it matters for defining our rights based on who is in office at all levels. And so thinking about the next couple of years, our civic participation is absolutely essential. And that's really what we're helping to drive. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for those remarks. Now we will turn to audience questions. So you can enter your question into the chat box, and please, if you can, include your name and where you're from. If we don't get to your question during tonight's discussion, please don't hesitate to reach out to our office at adamsmith.house.gov/contact. And you can also sign up to our newsletter to stay up to date with what's happening both in Congress and in the 9th District at adamsmith.house.gov/subscribe. So the audience had the chance to submit questions ahead of the event, so we'll start with one of those, and then I'll turn to the live questions. This is for the panelists, our guest panelists. Someone asked, beyond donating and voting, what can we do on the ground that would support you in your work? I'll turn it over to any of the panelists who wants to.
I can start quickly. So we are a grassroots organization. So for Pro-Choice Washington, we gather volunteers and participants to actually turn out field canvassing and door knocking and being really present in the community to have those one-on-one conversations. So not only can individuals contribute through their dollars, which is super impactful, but also showing up and actually having dialogues in these districts that are particularly at risk is a really helpful way for people to help us on the ground. I'll turn it over to some other folks.
Yeah, I will say we have a similar organizing model, and that's absolutely critical to get out there and talking to voters. I will also say that this may not sound super exciting, but talking about abortion is absolutely critical. Everyone has an abortion story, even if they don't know it, because 1 in 4 pregnant or women, and we don't know the statistics around other people, but 1 in 4 women has had an abortion in their lifetime. So someone you know and someone you love has been impacted by abortion care and could be impacted in a state where abortion is being banned. And so part of it, of reducing the stigma and really talking about what abortion truly is and the positive impacts that it has in people's lives is absolutely critical as well.
And I do just want to completely agree with Lisa that we have to talk about abortion and use the word. I think part of what contributed to getting us where we are is the stigma around abortion. And it's really important that we just talk about it and voice our support for it. And of course, voting is the best way to do that. To help clinics, I know they said besides donating, but donating is so important, both to abortion funds who help patients travel from out of state to get to us, and also donating directly to clinics because patients need well-resourced clinics to be able to travel to. And something that is often forgotten is out-of-state patients who come from lower income families or communities don't qualify for any of our state programs. So often it is the clinics themselves who are subsidizing the patient's care if they have trouble affording it. And I know for Cedar River Clinics and our staff, and I know it's definitely true for Planned Parenthood, is we are committed to helping all the patients we can, no matter where they come from. And this is a health crisis, and it's really important that states that have legal protection for abortion also have financial support for clinics and providers and the patients themselves.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to some live questions. This question is for Congressman Smith. Can Democrats proactively call for votes up or down on abortion, gay marriage, interracial marriage, separation of church and state now and get people on the record?
We have on a couple of occasions. We had a vote codifying Roe versus Wade a couple of weeks ago. We had a vote on the Equality Act, which would put LGBTQ rights in with the same thing as civil rights based on race, religion, and creed. So yes, we can, and we have. And those votes are on record in the House. And, you know, we have not been able to get the movement in the Senate that we would like to see. Yes, we can absolutely do that. And I think it's an important step. There were a couple other questions I was scrolling through there that people asked about that I wasn't clear on some of the federal legislative options. It is highly speculative whether or not we can use federal land and make that available for abortion. Someone mentioned the Hyde Amendment, and yes, that is a problem. No federal funds going there. That's why I say we should be really cautious about imagining that there's some executive action that President Biden can just take. There are limitations to that. There's also been discussions about tribal land, but tribal land is tribal land. The tribes can do what they want on it, but they're going to make that decision, not anybody else. I would urge us to work with the tribes and try to get their cooperation and help. Lastly, there are questions about expanding the Supreme Court, and that's a simple majority vote. Well, with the filibuster proof in the Senate, we could conceivably do that. There are proposals right now. We do not have the votes in the Senate to take that step. I don't think there's even 50 votes there, much less 60. So an education campaign needs to be worked to be able to expand this and to be more effective. And again, we got to think about the messaging. We have to figure out, how do we get more votes? How do we get to the point where we can get 50 or 60 votes and solid support in the House? So that's sort of the legislative landscape that we're trying to take. Also, sorry, I shouldn't read the questions. It always distracts me. Someone asked why we're not doing this in person, because we did it fairly quickly and we wanted to be able to pull a large group together. We've got 92 people on this. There's no way we would have been able to get 92 people to an in-person event. So this was an effective way to get a lot of people together quickly. Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. Next question is for our guest panelists. Can you address the impact of the increase in religiously affiliated and owned hospitals and healthcare facilities on the ability of abortions and reproductive choice in Washington state?
I can lead off, then I'll turn it over to my partners. So Pro-Choice Washington is part of the coalition that has been working to pass the Keep Our Care Act, which is a bill in Washington that is designed to regulate future hospital mergers. And the reason that is because over the last decade across the West, but specifically in Washington state, there has been a pretty significant increase in hospital systems merging. And when that has happened, these private systems implement a values structure and a values policy system within their hospital structure. And in many cases, that has resulted in the denial of fundamental care like reproductive care, gender affirming care, and end-of-life care, all of which is protected in Washington state. But because these private health systems, which have now expanded to 50% of the hospital beds in our state, that means if you go to a hospital, especially for complicated abortion care, you may face a denial. And we worked over the last several years to pass something called the Protecting Pregnant Patients Act, which was passed in 2021. And that was designed to actually allow providers to give life-saving care safely for people who are experiencing life-threatening pregnancy issues like ectopic pregnancy and miscarriage care. And that took several years to pass just to allow for the providers to provide life-saving care. So we're still seeing these 50% of hospital beds in Washington state subject to the potential denial of care across that spectrum. And when you're thinking about the number that Mercedes shared earlier, which is a massive increase in patients coming to our system and likely are coming at different stages of pregnancy, we're going to need every aspect of healthcare in our state to be able to provide that care safely and well, and not to have patients coming up against life-threatening situations and potentially be turned away in our state. I'll turn it over to others.
I would just like to provide a provider perspective. So because of this, these religiously affiliated hospital mergers, a common directive is often that they can't provide care to a pregnant person if there is still a fetal heartbeat. So these patients often get transferred to Cedar River Clinic or the University of Washington and other providers. And I think part of what was so ominous about the SCOTUS decision is in states where abortion is illegal, providing transfers is not an option. So we're going to see a lot of negative health outcomes and fatalities as well. And I do also want to throw in, we also have had cases where there was no fetal heartbeat detected, but staff at the hospitals were too afraid to help the pregnant person. So they ended up getting transferred. So again, this isn't going to be an option in some states for timely care. And we keep saying it's a health crisis, but it will end up being a fatal one.
I don't have much to add. I think my colleagues covered it very nicely. I will say one thing is that we do see that there is a disparate impact of hospital mergers on different communities of color and rural communities, particularly because in rural communities, there's smaller hospital systems, and in an evolving health system, it is really hard to keep up with escalating hospital costs. And so it's very often that religiously affiliated big systems come into these rural communities. And so if you only have one hospital within several hundred miles of where you live and you are facing a health crisis, you may not be able to get to the life-saving care that you need right away. And so that is really compounding the challenges of these hospital mergers.
Thank you. The next question is for both Congressman Smith and our guest panelists. The question is, the anti-abortion movement is looking to push for a national ban on abortion. I have massive fear of that happening. What would Washington state do if that worst case scenario ever came to pass?
Well, the first thing I say is we have to work very hard to make sure that worst case scenario does not come to pass. And that has to be the focus. If in fact the United States Congress passed a national ban on abortion, we would fight it in the courts. We would fight it and pass our own laws here in the state. We have the laws. We're going through this to some degree with the marijuana legislation. Federal law still makes any use of cannabis illegal. But as you well know, we have, not just medicinal, but legal use just in general. That's awkward and difficult, and we're working to deal with that. But we would try to protect ourselves. But I cannot overstate enough the importance of making sure that we move forward politically to not allow that majority to show up in Congress. And towards that end, I want to address two issues that I saw in the Q&A. One, which I think is the exact right way to talk about this. This is about women's rights, and this is about an ideologically extreme approach that really wants to strip women of their rights. I mean, you have to be aware that until like the early 70s, there were all kinds of places that wouldn't hire a married woman. The State Department, I was adopted. My biological mother worked for the State Department. If she had gotten married or had a child, she couldn't keep her job until 1973. So the agenda here isn't just about stopping abortion. It's about telling women what they can and cannot do and taking away their rights and taking them out of the workforce and putting back in place a really sadistic, paternalistic way of running our society. And I think we have to make that case. The other thing that I want to address is someone said, we vote for Democrats and what difference does it make? We lost Roe anyway. Well, look, if enough people had gone up and voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, we wouldn't have lost Roe. Okay. So you want to know a clear, stark difference on whether or not Democrats win elections or not? That's it. 3 Supreme Court justices that would not have been there to overturn Roe if Hillary Clinton had won that election. Now, and I just want to urge people to be aware of this. And in 2010, a lot of people were dissatisfied with a whole bunch of different things that they didn't think that the Democrats got done. So the Republicans came rolling in to control Congress. It makes a difference. I mean, you can all make an individual judgment as to whether or not it makes enough of a difference. Personally, I've made mine. I've seen it. I think it makes enough of a difference, but don't for 1 second think that it doesn't make a difference. It absolutely does on a wide range of equality issues.
Do our other panelists want to take that question as well?
I can briefly, and actually everybody has something. I'll just briefly say that, just reiterating the idea of election, and we've heard this a lot, of course, in our electoral work. And, this is, again, the long game, right? And we're thinking about change over several election periods. And the surest way for us to hand over the remaining power that we hold is to not participate in an area that we still hold power, which is voting. And so by allowing the agenda, which is absolutely right, which is taking whole swaths of society and taking them out of participation. So it's women, it's people of color, it's LGBTQI communities, the whole bodily autonomy conversation, and the way to curb, the broader democracy participation, like voting rights. It's all part of the same interconnected agenda to take whole groups of people out of power and out of participation in society. And so if we don't actually play a role in the way that we still are allowed to execute that power, we will hand it over. So we have to vote.
I think complacency is dangerous. As Kia said, 87% of our state legislators are up for re-election. So it's really important that we vote. And I think also this is an opportunity for us in November to make our vote a protest. As studies have shown, the majority of Americans support some sort of abortion rights. And I think it needs to stop being the silent majority. I think people of all parties need to vote and do it in protest so that we show our numbers and vote for candidates who are unapologetically pro-abortion.
Yes, I agree with what everyone has just said. And I think that for decades, anti-abortion voters have been voting as single issue voters. And they have always, even though Roe versus Wade was the law of the land, they had this end game. They had a long-term goal and they didn't care. And they were going to vote as single issue voters. We have to do the same. We need to have single issue pro-abortion voters. I also think that there are people who support the access to abortion care who have voted against that interest, in part because Roe has been the law of the land. And so they thought that it did not matter if they were voting for an anti-abortion candidate. That's not true anymore. And that vote really has legs now. And so we absolutely have to be single issue voters to support abortion rights.
Thank you. The next question is for our guest panelists. What will we be doing to help out-of-state and in-state women needing transportation for abortions? And I'll also add on to that question quickly and add another one. What ways can we help women in states that have banned abortion?
I can start.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I can start that one. I will say that Governor Inslee has made an initial investment of $1 million for abortion providers to help absorb this out-of-state increase. And that is an area that we are going to need support. We are going to need funding and logistical support from the government to help absorb these patients. We also need to support abortion funds. Mercedes mentioned our local abortion fund is Northwest Abortion Access Fund, and they are the real experts in facilitating travel, lodging, helping get appointments, childcare, everything. They really are the experts in that. And so supporting them in helping bring patients, they support in-state patients too. I mean, there are many, many barriers to accessing abortion care, and they are there every step of the way to help bring patients in the door. So supporting them, and also really working with our state government officials about financially supporting bringing patients in, because as Mercedes said, out-of-state patients are not eligible for any financial support. And so unless they happen to be on an insurance plan that one of our providers happens to be contracted with, which chances are is not likely. So that is, I think those are the two main things that we need to be looking at right now to absorb those out-of-state patients.
Thank you. And for Congressman Smith, if Democrats can overturn the filibuster and hold the House, can they pass legislation fairly quickly to reestablish abortion rights?
If we have the votes, yes. Now, I mean, there's a lot that goes into what is the precise language of that. You know, I don't think every single Democrat in the House or the Senate is 100% pro-choice right now. We'd have to look at what the language is and whether the language is there. So, it's pretty simple math. I mean, you got to get 218 votes, and then you got to have 50 who are willing to overturn the filibuster. But it's not as simple, and I will agree, it's not as simple as just vote for whatever Democrat. I think you should absolutely ask Democrats, you know, where are they at on all of the issues about choice? You can say you're pro-choice, but are you willing to support codifying Roe versus Wade and everything that goes into it? I would urge you to get very specific when you're talking to candidates about what their pro-choice agenda is and whether or not they're willing to support that. Get the votes. Yep, you can absolutely get it done, and I know it's a priority.
Thank you. And for the panelists, what are some proven ways to normalize abortion and remove the stigma?
So we released a guide called How to Talk About Abortion, and it's on our website, but there's a lot of different resources around this. And one of the main ways, which has been said a couple of times by our incredible panelists, is saying the word abortion and talking about it in the context of healthcare, right? Because it's often talked about like this niche issue that's related to a very specific group of women who don't want to have a kid. But we're talking about this as, yes, that's one story, and it's a really important and valid story. And there's so many other ways in which abortion shows up in healthcare and within our society. And if we don't talk about it like this, if we don't say that it is absolutely an acceptable and important part of our healthcare system, then it's easy to keep it in that very politicized and polarized conversation. And so I think not really allowing it to get back in that space is an important part for all of us to play, and keeping it very much within the healthcare, within all of our interests to actually protect this essential healthcare procedure. So that's one.
Thank you. For Congressman Smith, with Justice Thomas calling on the court to reconsider rulings that protect the right to contraception and same-sex marriage, will the court reconsider these decisions?
I think there's a distinct risk that they will. Now, you know, notably, Justice Thomas was the only one who put that into his decision. But I mean, we're talking Amy Coney Barrett, Kavanaugh. I mean, you can certainly see all of them being perfectly willing to do that. And I'm forgetting it here, but I think it only takes 4 justices to agree to hear a case. And once they agree to hear it, there's a huge risk that you would get a majority vote for that, because they've sort of boxed themselves in here. I have a law degree. I'm not really a lawyer. I haven't practiced in a heck of a long time, so I'm out of my depth here, but I will just sort of give the broad outlines of it. You know, the right to privacy, the right to individual things that gave us the right to interracial marriage, by the way, and also LGBTQ rights in terms of, you know, marriage, the right to access to contraception, all grew out of this interpretation of the 15th Amendment, 14th Amendment, one of those at any rate, that basically said, that, no state shall deprive anyone of the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But it's not specific. So the connection was made in the Roe decision, in the Loving decision, in the Griswold decision on contraception, that said, this is something that counts as life and liberty, that the legislatures cannot deprive you of because it is protected in the Constitution. And that is what the decision overturning Roe said, no, that's not a legitimate interpretation of the Constitution. That's not a legitimate right. So if the court were to uphold your right to contraception, your right to gay marriage, your right to homosexual sex for that matter, the right to not having that criminalized, on what basis would this court say that right exists? Where would they find it? It's a huge risk. And, not to get into all the judicial stuff, but part of what they did was they made this case that this wasn't a social agenda. This wasn't a policy agenda. They were just accurately interpreting the Constitution because they were originalists, which is a load of crap. This was an entire political agenda. Okay. They wanted their outcome. They wanted women back home, forgive me, barefoot and pregnant, and legally they were going to get there. Okay. Because where in the Constitution does it say that corporations are people or that money is speech? Okay. It ain't there. And yet they found those rights. Where in the Constitution does it say that a state can't regulate, at least to some extent, firearms? Where in the Constitution does it say that the EPA can't regulate pollution? Okay. So I think part of this, and this is something that's going to, that you can't just do it. We need to get our lawyers out there, okay, form our societies and start talking about what the Constitution really means instead of letting them drive this debate in that way. So yes, I think that is a huge risk. Thomas is going to look for every opportunity to drag the rest of them along with him. And as I just outlined, someone's got to show me the argument why at least 4, if not 5 of those other justices would go with him.
Thank you, Congressman. Another question for you. The Women's Health Act has stalled in the Senate. Is that act the best way to keep access to abortion safe at the national level? And if so, what are the key arguments from senators who are against it? What are some key arguments that we can use to promote its importance to voters in all states across the country?
Yes, I think it is the best way to do straightforward. It codifies Roe and it codifies the protection in a legislative way on a federal level. I don't know off the top of my head which senators opposed it. Well, they had that vote. I think it was all the Republicans. And was it just Manchin the only? Yeah. And I think they just have a more limited view about what rights should be available in terms of access to abortion. I think step one would be, go ask Joe Manchin why he feels that way. Because I don't think he identifies as pro-life. But again, there are a variety of different, ways to slice that. So I think the first thing we have to do is answer your question. I don't have the answer off the top of my head. We need to go find out. And then, is the Republican, go Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski. There are some Republicans who I've identified as being supportive of choice to at least some degree. I think we should go talk to them as well and try to push that.
Thank you. The next question is for our guest panelists. What is the plan for Washington when it comes to more complex or complicated or specialized cases that need care from a board-certified specialist when they are already, as noted previously, overworked and limited with staff?
I think I may need some clarity on that question. You're absolutely right that there is a provider shortage in the state of Washington, as there are in many states. I don't believe that Washington state law requires any additional board certification beyond being an OBGYN in order to provide complex abortion care, and especially later into pregnancy. So I'm not, I don't know, Mercedes, if you're aware of any other additional barriers that we can look at, but I do think it's investing in training, but I don't think anything beyond that.
You're correct, Lisa. There isn't anything beyond that. And at Cedar River Clinics, one of our one of our main focuses is training the future abortion providers. And I think that is an important place to focus as well. And I think that might be where our focus has to be able to continue achieving it. We have at Cedar River Clinics many abortion providers who are able to provide care into the second trimester. And I know there are many providers within the state who can do it, but it's also getting those providers trained and into other states and other areas, such as rural communities, as Lisa had mentioned, with there's only one hospital, that's all you have. So I think training and expanding care is really important. And the truth is Roe v. Wade was never enough. And many communities went without access. And it wasn't just rural communities, it was BIPOC communities and low-income communities. So I think it's important not only to react into this movement, but as Kia said, the long game, we need something better than Roe v. Wade.
Thank you. Another question for our guest panelists. How can women in states that currently have bans on abortion access care now? What are ways to access the abortion pill and surgical abortions? And will pregnant people face repercussions for traveling to another state to get an abortion?
I can start this one. I will say, just in the spirit of us being very clear about the current laws, there's not a single state that has yet being the operative word there, passed a bill that would prohibit, that would either target the patient themselves or target and prohibit someone from traveling out of state. We do not believe that there is any legal scenario in which that will survive a court challenge. Now, again, we would have said the same about Roe, but I will say right now, a patient in Texas or Arkansas or a state where a ban is in effect can travel to the state of Washington and should call an abortion provider and find that appointment, because we absolutely are here for them and those patients should come our way. However, we also know what could be coming next. And we know that there are extremist and overzealous prosecutors throughout the country in these banned states. But we are very proud at the elected officials that we have here in this state to help protect providers from participating in any kind of out-of-state investigations. And we also know that there is a whole cadre of lawyers who will be prepared to protect patients and protect providers if anyone from out of state tries to put their tentacles into our state. But right now, absolutely, an out-of-state patient should feel safe to come to the state of Washington to access care.
And I'll just, sorry about that, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, I think that is another challenge, is the education piece. I think in states where there are bans, we need to be able to communicate that there are states where it is still legal, like in Washington. And I think also to encourage people to also seek out reputable providers. And, you know, there are a couple of good websites like ineedana.com. And I think there are ways to find care. And of course, coming to Washington where it is legal. But I think getting that message out is really important as well. And some states are moving to try to make that impossible as well. Like I believe Idaho, in their law, is limiting advertising in their state around abortion. And you guys will have to correct me if that's not correct, Lisa and Kia.
No, I think that's all of that is correct. And each state obviously restricts abortion at different times throughout pregnancy. And so abortion pills are used up until 10 weeks of pregnancy. And so some of the states don't ban until later, although any ban is problematic and harmful. But so really understanding as much as possible the changing local legal landscape is really essential. But also to just build on Mercedes' point, of a reputable source. So I Need an A and abortionfinder.com. I believe I'll send the actual websites, but there are fake clinics called crisis pregnancy centers that are all across the country and all across Washington. And they actually exist at a 3-to-1 ratio to real clinics because of decades of efforts to close clinics throughout the region and the state. In fact, we had about a 50% decrease in clinics since the 1990s in Washington state, and an increase of fake pregnancy centers. And one of the things that is really concerning about this, and why it's really important for everybody to be very clear who they're going to, because these clinics do not actually provide medical care, they are not subject to HIPAA laws. And so there has been an increase in reporting of these clinics selling their data to big research companies and vice versa, or big tech companies, and sharing this data of folks who express an interest in seeking care or ask questions around pregnancy. And so your information can be sold and then be targeted by anti-abortion groups afterwards. And so because there is no digital protection, it is especially, not only because you need good medical care and they give false information or misleading information, but because it actually opens you up to a pretty risky space. And so making sure it's really reputable is essential. And that's also why abortion funds are super helpful, because they know where to go.
Thank you. This next question is also for our guest panelists. With expected increased traffic to various abortion providers in Washington, how will clinics ensure that all patients, regardless of what state they're from, receive quick and time-sensitive care? Will there be more funding to train more abortion providers and increase abortion facilities?
We hope so. I mean, is the honest answer. You know, as I said, we're committed to providing care, but there are limits. And, you know, we are coming out of the COVID world into the post-Roe world. So many clinics were recovering from COVID, so definitely need the financial support. And as we see more patients coming from out of state, just the things we've mentioned, patients needing financial support as well as clinics. So yes, Cedar River Clinics just recently reopened our clinic in Eastern Washington in Yakima. And honestly, part of that is because it was even before the leak decision, we were hearing there were really long wait times in Eastern Washington. And we had many Washingtonians traveling to us from that part of the state. So we wanted to provide better access in Eastern Washington. And it turned out the timing was perfect because of everything happening in the country. So we'll do our best, but we definitely need help.
Yeah, and another component that I think about when I hear this question is that we, and I know Cedar River will be the same, we're going to do everything we can to expand access, to expand availability, and that may impact the other critical services that reproductive healthcare providers provide. So Planned Parenthood and Cedar River provide the full range of contraceptive methods, gender-affirming hormone care, STI screening and testing. And if we're making more room on our schedules to provide abortion care, we need to think about what it means to then bolster other providers to provide more of the rest of sexual and reproductive health care if they're not able to provide abortion care. So there's that sort of ripple effect, because we are absolutely committed to providing abortion care to everyone who needs it and as quickly as we can get them in. But does that mean that we're not able to provide as much birth control? And then lastly, I just want to name one way that we, and Cedar River has also been doing, but in an effort to expand access, have really been investing in telehealth, because that will really allow people, if you can get access to medication, abortion, drugs while sitting from your own home, that will really help expand access for folks who need to come in, who are maybe later in their pregnancy or for some reason are not getting a medication abortion. And so critical investments in the infrastructure and the training to provide that will really help ease that those waiting periods.
Thank you. With the time remaining, we'll take one more question from the audience, and then I'll turn it over to Congressman Smith for closing remarks. Our final question will be, the Dobbs decision by the court indicated that the court has now become partisan, political, and openly biased. Congressman Smith, the court was supposed to be the checks and balances of our 3 branches of government. How can our democracy recover from this partisan change and the shift of a neutral court?
It's going to be very difficult. I mean, it's one of many things that you've seen in the last 10 years, that are pulling us away from the basic principles of a representative democracy, of a system of checks and balances, of a system of allowing, majority opinion to decide issues and for people's individual rights to be protected. I mean, we've got the January 6th commission going on right now that, Donald Trump and his supporters wouldn't even accept the outcome of the election. They were just going to overturn it. And I think we've got a real challenge that is in addition to the challenge of educating people about abortion and then reasserting the right to make sure people have access to that, just letting people, reminding people of what representative democracy and how our country is supposed to function. It's not just if you can figure out a way to force your views on everybody else, then go do it. Okay. And that's what the Supreme Court right now represents. And it's what the pro-life movement and the far right has been pushing for decades, is to get a court that will do their bidding, regardless of the impact of the country and regardless of the impact on the Constitution. Now, unfortunately, the Constitution is what it is. I am fond of our founding fathers to a certain degree. You got to remember what they were working with. The entire history of the world at that point, there was no democracy at all in the world at that point. So they took it and they gave it to white male property owners to have a voice in their government, whereas no one had before. And we've expanded since then. But there's also a lot of stuff in the Constitution that's really inconvenient. I've jokingly referred before when people have asked me, well, why can't you do this? Well, here's all these systems of checks and balances and limitations. So I tend to say that the founding fathers, those bastards, when I'm thinking about how we try to get things done. So they boxed us in. And where the Supreme Court is concerned, they boxed us in that they have lifetime appointments. And literally the only accountability for a Supreme Court justice once they are appointed is to be impeached. That's it. That's the only tool we have, which of course requires majority vote in the House and 2/3 vote in the Senate, which is a big limitation. I really think, and this is going to take some time, but we need to build support for this idea of limiting the jurisdiction of the federal courts in terms of the rights that they can take away from people, because that is one area that the Constitution does not restrict us. You get into the history here, and John Marshall dramatically expanded the rights of the courts, and everyone just sort of accepted it for 200 years now. It wasn't in the Constitution that the Supreme Court would have the final say on what was constitutional. It's not. I mean, nowhere does it say that they should have that jurisdiction. Nowhere does it say that they should have the right to overturn state laws. They can resolve conflicts between state laws. So I think we need to begin an education process that says our democracy is dependent upon a Supreme Court that is less tyrannical. And at the moment, it is a conservative court, but the Republicans used to complain back in the 60s that it was a left-wing court. However you want to do it, I just think giving an unelected body that is appointed for life and completely unaccountable this much power is wrong. We can complain about the power that the president has. We can complain about the power that Congress has. We're up every 2 years. President's up every 4 years. He or she only gets 2 terms. Senate's up every. You have the opportunity, if they go way too far, to hold them accountable. You have no such opportunity on the Supreme Court. And I think what the Constitution gives us the opportunity to do is to limit the power that they have. And I think that is where we ought to really focus our attention. Expanding the court, I could do that too. That's a bit more of a roll of the dice, because you expand the court, you never know when the next President Trump's going to be able to pick one of those or multiple of those judges. So I think focus on the jurisdiction. That's the best thing we can do. I want to thank our panelists, in particular. The level of expertise that Mercedes, Lisa, and Kia bring is incredibly helpful. I learned a lot of things that I didn't know about the law and about what's available and how you work with healthcare clinics. And I really want to thank you. I want to thank everyone for participating. And the last thing I'll say, I saw one of the questions in the chat, you've got all these groups saying, asking you to give them money, to stand up for choice. And you're like, is it a scam? These 3 organizations that you have here today, go to them. Okay. We have existing known organizations, either, donate to them or if you're wondering about an organization, these are the people to ask. Who are these people? Is this legit? There are some clearly identifiable organizations so that you don't get scammed. Support the groups that are out there doing the work. And we have great examples of 3 of those organizations with us today.
Thank you, Congressman Smith, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight and asked questions. This concludes tonight's panel discussion. If you have additional questions that we didn't get to, please don't hesitate to reach out to our office at adamsmith.house.gov/contact. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to our guest panelists, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you all.